It was April 28th, 1996, in the city of Hobart, on the island of Tasmania, at the end of the world. Looking out from Hobart's majestic port, at the southern end of the island, there is nothing but frigid waters and the icy wasteland of Antarctica beyond. And although Tasmania's dimensions are distorted on a globe to look larger than it really is, you can fly over the entire island in about 30 minutes. In 1996, Tasmania had a population of just 460,000 people. Its capital city, Hobart, only 126,000. A small settlement, forged from the harsh prison colonies of the British Empire. The place very much feels like a lonely last bastion of humanity, at the end of all things. At 6 a.m., 28-year-old Martin Bryant woke to the sound of his alarm clock. Stirring next to him was his girlfriend, 20-year-old Petra Wilmot. The night before, they had eaten dinner at the home of Bryant's mother, just down the street from them in the Hobart suburb of Newtown, before drinking and dancing until midnight at a now defunct sticky-floored hole called the Cadillac Club. Martin and Petra had not been dating long, but enjoyed each other's company. Nothing serious. Just frequenting trendy bars, clubs, and making short jaunts into the countryside where Petra had grown up. Mostly, however, they just spent time casually hanging out, blissfully doing nothing in particular. 2 weeks earlier, in mid-April, in the middle of one of their rambling hangouts, Petra had accompanied her new boyfriend on a quick errand to the Meijer department store in central Hobart. Martin Bryant wanted to buy a sports bag and was very particular about the size, even bringing a tape measure with him. Bryant said it was for his Tai Chi equipment, but this was a lie. The large blue tennis bag he eventually selected was going to contain guns. Lots of guns. Some serious hardware. And a veritable boatload of ammunition. Petra liked her new boyfriend, and his quiet, gentle ways. He was tall. He had a square jaw, and a somewhat statuesque bone structure. He had long blonde hair, raggedly worn in the grunge style popular in the mid-1990s. A few days earlier, Petra and her boyfriend had spent Anzac Day together in the countryside, taking gleeful and carefree happy snaps of each other on a camera. They very much seemed like a young couple enjoying a spell of puppy love. But the morning of April 28th was different. As they ate breakfast, Martin Bryant told Petra he needed to be alone that morning. He had a few things to take care of. But, he said, maybe they could hang out later that day. These words were hollow. He had no intention of doing so. Petra departed Bryant's house shortly after 8 o'clock. At precisely 9:47 a.m., Martin Bryant set his security alarm and stepped out into the chilly autumn air, because, of course, late April in the southern hemisphere signaled a slow descent into a rather gloomy Tasmanian winter, very different from the rest of Australia. Inner Hobart is built to resemble an old-fashioned European city with cobbled streets and splendid 19th century architecture. Combined with a much cooler climate than mainland Australia, and the roving populations of deer introduced by early settlers, you'd be forgiven if you thought that you were somewhere in northern Europe itself, until the sight of eucalyptus forests, wombats, and maybe even the odd Tasmanian devil brought you back to reality. Bryant wandered over to his yellow 240GL Volvo sedan with a surfboard on the roof rack. He threw his sports bag into the back seat. Inside was an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, an SLR semi-automatic rifle, a bolt-action hunting rifle, and a Daewoo 12-gauge shotgun. The bag also contained 2 pairs of handcuffs, a long hunting knife, rope, several cans of gasoline, kindling, a camcorder, and box after box of rifle and shotgun ammunition. To be clear, a semi-automatic rifle is not a machine gun. You cannot just hold down the trigger and spray a torrent of death. It's one trigger pull, one bullet. Semi-automatic means that the empty cartridge is ejected and a new bullet loaded automatically, just as you would get from a typical handgun, allowing the rifleman to sustain a much faster rate of fire. Semi-automatic rifles, like the ones Bryant loaded into his car that day, are also fairly powerful. The AR-15, for instance, can potentially pierce metal from a quarter-mile away. Such, at any rate, was the 28-year-old's arsenal. Not that Bryant had a license to own or operate any of these weapons. Martin Bryant climbed into the car and began the 90-minute drive to the Tasman Peninsula, 60 miles southeast of Hobart, and his final destination at the tip of the landmass, Port Arthur, population just 200. Port Arthur is a World Heritage Site and tourist spot because of its cluster of 11 ruined buildings that had once formed a 19th century prison, the Alcatraz of the Southern Hemisphere. Port Arthur was the place where British convicts who were already in Australia were taken if they re-offended. From 1833 to 1877, it was a prison for the hardest of hard knocks that employed a combination of corporal punishment and psychological torture. Several convicts just murdered other prisoners so they could be executed and no longer go on living in the place. Over 1,600 graves surround the prison. Only 180, those of prison staff and soldiers, are marked. On the day of April 28, 1996, over 600 tourists would wander amongst the ruins, all potential targets for Bryant's guns. Half an hour into his journey, Martin Bryant pulled into the small town of Midway Point and stopped at a convenience store. He bought a lighter for his gasoline and kindling. He did not even wait for his change. 15 minutes down the road, Bryant made another stop in the town of Sorel, where he inexplicably bought a bottle of ketchup. Then it was on to the town of Forset, where he pulled into a service station and bought a cup of coffee. Chatting with the station owner, Bryant said he was going surfing that day at Roaring Beach. The service station owner thought this was odd, because the conditions that day were calm, and there weren't going to be any large waves. A little further down the road, Martin Bryant arrived in the town of Tirana, where he topped up his car with fuel, and then pulled off the Arthur Highway and drove a short distance to the Seascape guest house. It was a 2-story pink and white cottage that provided a stunning view of the Tasman Peninsula and the ocean beyond. Seascape was owned by David and Nolene Martin, aged 72 and 69 respectively. They had just waved off a couple of tourists who had been staying with them. Martin Bryant's yellow Volvo pulled up their gravel driveway. At 11:15 a.m., David and Nolene were inside, cleaning up after their guests. Bryant knocked on the door of the cottage. He knew the elderly couple. In 1992, Bryant's father had tried to buy the Seascape guest house, but the Martins had beaten him to the purchase. He had tried to buy another property from the Martins, who owned several holiday homes in the area, but was refused. Bryant's father had killed himself the following year in 1993. His son held a grudge against the elderly couple, blaming them for his father's untimely end. And so, as Nolene Martin approached the door of the cottage, Bryant quickly shouldered and aimed his AR-15. When Nolene swung open the door, Bryant shot her in the shoulder. She went down. Then Bryant stormed into the house, pulling out his hunting knife from its sheath as he went, and stabbed David Martin in the guts with it. The 72-year-old man crumpled to the floor. Bryant stuffed a cloth gag in his mouth. Then he caved in Nolene's skull with 5 bashes from an unidentified blunt object. Afterward, he shot David Martin in the head. Having just committed double murder, Bryant closed the door to the cottage and began the next phase of his plan. Many more people were going to die that day. Meet Martin Bryant. Martin John Bryant was born on May 7th, 1967, in Hobart, Tasmania, to Maurice, a dock worker, and Carleen, a laborer in a chocolate factory. The birth notice in the Hobart Mercury newspaper described Martin as a bouncing boy, which in mid-20th century slang means the baby was healthy and full of vigor. As a newborn, Martin completely rejected breastfeeding, and as an infant, he was averse to any sign of physical affection from his parents. Once he started walking at 16 months old, Martin would constantly try to escape the house, with his parents once finding him on top of the neighbor's chicken coop, and another time on a swing set, some distance away on the other side of the railway tracks. As such, Carleen Bryant fashioned a harness and a leash, and kept Martin confined to the veranda so she could perform house chores. Otherwise, if she took her eyes off him for even a second, he would always try to escape. By the time Martin was 3 years old, his parents had become alarmed by his slow speech development and stunted motor skills. The young boy also seemed incapable of using his imagination to entertain himself, and any toys he was given he would simply destroy. Carleen described her son as constantly acting out, going out of his way to be annoying, and showing fits of temper. Many toddlers are like this. They can be troublesome. But this was every waking hour of every day. Beyond the rages, Martin appeared to be emotionless and rather vacant behind the eyes. And, again, he had no time for kisses or cuddles from his mother. Martin's parents began to suspect there was something seriously wrong with him, and Carleen gave up on any sort of normal mother-son relationship altogether. Her day-to-day routine became one of vigilance, logistics, and survival. To stop him from smashing things, to stop him from running off, and to prevent him from eating inanimate objects. He once had to be taken to hospital after swallowing a carpenter's nail. Meanwhile, Maurice's response was to figure out what the problem was and to try and, quote-unquote, normalize the boy. Find the problem, fix the problem. When, in 1972, Martin's sister Lindy came along, she developed without any sort of behavioral or intellectual abnormality. And because of where things went, I will state, there is no evidence whatsoever that Martin or Lindy were subjected to child abuse. In 1973, the Bryants enrolled Martin in a fee-paying primary school operated by the Quakers, which had a fantastic reputation, in an attempt to come to grips with Martin's slow development. The report from his first year was that his behavior was aggressive and destructive. He failed to make friends, and his language skills were extremely poor. In 1974, he was assessed by a child specialist who said that Martin might have an intellectual disability. His low intelligence seemed to surprise people, since he gave no outward physical sign of being mentally impaired. He just looked like a cute little blonde kid, straight out of a wholesome family sitcom. Then, when people began to see Martin behave aggressively, strangely, or stupidly, they were surprised and dismayed. This remained a pattern throughout his entire life, as he grew from a cute little blonde kid into a strapping young man with an IQ of 60. Given his lack of progress at the fee-paying Quaker school, Martin's parents decided to save their money and transfer him to the government-run Newtown Primary School. Martin's efforts to make friends there were interpreted as aggravating rather than endearing, such as his common practice of sneaking up behind other students and jumping on their backs. As a result, Martin was a loner and sometimes was bullied, with gangs of students chasing him through the streets after school until he burst into tears. But, in turn, Martin went out of his way to bully children who were smaller than him. It is difficult to determine which came first. Meanwhile, Martin proved incapable of either writing or mathematics, and the only school activities that he seemed to have any interest in were arts and crafts. Martin would frequently disrupt the class and merely laugh when teachers tried to reprimand him. He seemed to have a limited understanding of right and wrong, and never displayed any remorse. The teachers would often wind up kicking Martin out of the classroom, so they could just get on with the lesson, and Martin would spend the rest of the day in the halls, or the playground, or just wandering the neighborhood. One time, at a swimming class, Martin removed a snorkel from another boy while the boy was diving, nearly drowning him. In 1977, in grade 4, Martin was given a 2-day suspension for disruptive behavior, during which his parents got him assessed by a child psychologist. The report reveals that Martin not only had an intellectual disability, but he had been torturing animals. Combined with the rejection of all parental affection, the emotionless behavior, and the inability to relate to others, it seems quite clear in retrospect that Martin was a congenital psychopath, born without the capacity to feel empathy or put himself in the shoes of others. No compassion, no remorse. And while congenital psychopaths like Ted Bundy eventually learned to ape human emotion and manipulate people in order to get what they want, Martin Bryant had an intellectual disability. He'd forever be a low-functioning psychopath, never fully understanding others, quickly wearing out his welcome with new acquaintances, seeing no problem with cruelty or crime if he could avoid punishment. He was an overgrown toddler, randomly engaging in mindless acts of aggression, indulging in selfishness and half-baked lies, and never fully comprehending right and wrong, or the consequences of his actions. In 1979, when Martin was 12 years old, he made it onto the local news, but not in a good way. Martin had been taken to hospital with severe burns, allegedly sustained from playing with fireworks. The burns were so bad that Martin was missing several weeks of school. The initially sympathetic reporter asked Martin, "You're going to be here for a while longer, aren't you?" "Yeah, about a week," said Martin. The reporter followed up with, "Do you think you'll be playing with firecrackers anymore?" "Yes," answered Martin. With slight exasperation creeping into her voice, the reporter asked, "Don't you think you've learned a lesson from this?" Martin replied, "Yes, but I'm still going to play with them." The 12-year-old, resting in bed with his arms folded behind his head, gave the impression he was just a young delinquent with a bad attitude. His relatively normal appearance giving no clue that he was intellectually impaired or incapable of putting 2 and 2 together. Don't want to get burned? Don't play with fireworks again. As far as Martin was concerned, a bad thing had happened, he was in hospital, and he couldn't wait to play with fireworks again because fireworks were fun. He certainly didn't have the social intelligence to tell the reporter what she obviously wanted to hear. But the situation might be even more alarming. Martin's schoolmates have since claimed he wasn't playing with fireworks, but with fire. According to their version of events, while at the beach, Martin had poured gasoline all over himself and then deliberately set himself alight. A bunch of teenagers tackled him to the ground and rolled him around in the sand to extinguish the flames. Then they fetched Martin's horrified mother, and the boy was taken to hospital. Apparently, Martin Bryant was in the habit of wandering up and down the beach with a can of gasoline, threatening to pour it on people's campfires. If this version is true, then Martin's parents must have instructed him to tell the reporter he'd been playing with fireworks instead. Martin was perfectly capable of lying. He did so often. And this was a decidedly less bizarre and sinister story for the television. The following year, 1980, Martin Bryant was enrolled in special education classes at Newtown High School. Special ed, when it's good, can help students with a variety of limitations to reach their true potential. But it appeared that special ed at Newtown High was one of those programs designed to just sweep students under the rug, to get them out of the way while teaching staff focused their attentions on their regular duties and students who required no such special help. After a few perfunctory reports that said Martin was off to a good start and gradually making progress, his academic performance and relations with other students deteriorated. He didn't try at all, in any class, except woodworking and art. He rarely spoke. Other students began to refer to him as the Shadow. In 1981, for Martin's 14th birthday, his father made the mistake of giving him an air rifle. Martin became obsessed with it. He would hide in a nearby creek and fire the gun at passing cars. At night, he would fire it randomly across the bay. The neighbors once saw him shoot a parrot out of a tree, walk up to it, and then shoot it several more times in the head until the bird's tiny skull was obliterated. Martin would also shoot rabbits, flay them, and then carry the carcasses around the neighborhood, knocking on doors, hoping to sell people the meat. Back in special ed, the teacher instructed the students to talk about what they did on the weekend. Martin talked about torturing an echidna. Martin briefly made a friend, a schoolmate named Greg Leahy. One day they were walking to the Bryant home, and Greg witnessed Martin pick up a cat, seize its legs, and try to tear it apart with his bare hands. Greg forced Martin to let the cat go, relatively unharmed. Another time, Greg was along with the Bryants on a fishing trip, and Martin thrust a spear at him as if to stab him. Martin's father, Maurice, made the boy apologize to Greg. On 3 separate occasions during the summer of 1981, Martin aimed his air rifle at Greg and pulled the trigger. The gun was unloaded, and Martin always treated this as a hilarious joke. Then, when Martin and Greg were spearfishing off the Tasman Peninsula, Martin used the tip of the spear gun to stab Greg in the head. Again, Martin thought this was hilarious. Greg's wetsuit prevented serious injury, and after the boys got to shore, Greg punched Martin in the face, stalked off, and had nothing more to do with him. On May 6th, 1983, the day before Martin's 16th birthday, his parents withdrew him from school. Stranger than fiction. For the rest of 1983, Martin Bryant laid about the house watching TV, occasionally going out to fire his air rifle or torment some animals. His father's attempts to find him an entry-level unskilled labor job proved fruitless. Martin made a bit of pocket money by doing very basic handiwork and gardening around the neighborhood. In February 1984, Martin was taken to another psychologist, this time to get a diagnosis for his intellectual disability, in order to get him on welfare. Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax had several sessions with Martin, who was unable or unwilling to concentrate on their conversation. He would constantly interrupt, one time to ask about the age of the psychologist's office and the fireplace in the room. Dax confirmed Martin's intellectual disability, and also concluded that he was unemployable because he would likely antagonize his employer and colleagues. Cannot read or write. Does a bit of gardening and watches TV. Only parents' efforts that prevent further deterioration. Could be schizophrenic, and parents face a bleak future with him. And so, at age 16, Martin Bryant was signed up for a lifelong disability pension. He continued to live with his parents, who managed his money to prevent him from spending too much at once, or on something particularly foolish. And Martin continued to do handiwork and gardening off the books. Otherwise, he spent his days indulging his quiet, strange, and sometimes violent behaviors. As his sister, Lindy, grew older and made friends, Martin started shouting abuse at them when they came over, or threatening them over the phone when they called the house. Martin spent the next 3 years in this living situation, with his father, Maurice, governing much of his day-to-day. Maurice lined up various odd jobs for Martin and tried to keep the boy out of trouble. And it was a mammoth task, requiring his father's constant vigilance and reprimands. But unlike many of Martin's former teachers, the boy usually did what Maurice told him to. In early 1987, when Martin was 19. He was walking through his neighborhood when he spotted a large house at 30 Clare Street with a horrendously overgrown garden. He walked up to the front door, knocked, and offered his services. The woman who answered the door was 54-year-old Helen Harvey, one of the heirs to the Tattersall lottery fortune. The Tattersall lottery was founded by George Adams, who became immensely wealthy from his cut of the ticket sales, the significant portion of each draw not handed over to lotto winners. Adams had no children, so when he died in 1904, one of the beneficiaries of his will was Adams's general manager, David Harvey, Helen's grandfather. When he died in 1927, part of the fortune passed to Helen's father, Lorimer, and when he died, Helen inherited an investment income worth roughly $450,000 per year in modern money. Despite her wealth, Helen Harvey kept a job working for Tasmanian Railways for a few years until, in 1961, at age 28, she quit to spend the rest of her life living alone with her mother Hilza at 30 Clare Street. The two women became recluses, hoarders, and kept literally dozens of cats and dogs. In 1987, when she met Martin, 54-year-old Helen Harvey was viewed by locals as a harmless eccentric. She'd pop down to the shops and chat with the clerks about how she used to be friends with Errol Flynn or Rock Hudson. She didn't bathe. She stank. And she was missing several teeth and was highly obese. Back home, she and her 76-year-old mother lived in the most appalling squalor. Helen hired 19-year-old Martin Bryant to clear her yard, a task that took several days, and then to regularly mow her lawn from that point forward. He was also tasked with feeding the 17 dogs that lived in the house and the 40 cats that inhabited the garage. Martin was not asked to clean, and the house remained highly unsanitary, with dog shit and random trash all over the floor, the stench of rotting meat, and dirty dishes in the sink that were never cleaned. One bowl in the microwave accumulated so much mold that it had grown out of the bowl, out of the microwave, and spread across the wall to the vent above the oven. Helen and Martin struck up a bizarre friendship. They began taking day trips all over Hobart together, and people began to assume that Martin was Helen's son. And in case you're wondering, according to all available sources, Helen and Martin did not have a sexual relationship. But she lavished gifts on him. This included cars. Helen and Martin would walk into a dealership, and Martin would point to the car that he liked, despite not having a driver's license, and Helen would pay in cash. Then, a few weeks later, they'd sell the car at a loss and buy a new one. Helen Harvey is thought to have bought and sold upwards of 60 cars during her lifetime, mostly during a splurge in the 1970s, and again after she met Martin. Very often, in their trips around town, Helen did the driving, and Martin would suddenly reach over from the passenger's seat and yank the wheel to the side as his idea of a joke. Helen had 3 car accidents and several near misses as a result. She began telling people that she never drove over 60 kilometers per hour, that's 37 miles per hour, when Martin was in the car. For his part, Martin began driving without a license in whatever vehicle Helen had gifted him. In 1990, Martin stormed out of his house after an argument with his father and went to live with Helen and her mother Hilza full-time. In June of that year, someone tipped off the health authorities about the state of 30 Clare Street. So much rubbish had accumulated in the house, and the two women's health had so thoroughly deteriorated that they were unable to go upstairs and were sleeping in beds in the utterly filthy kitchen. During the day, Hilza Harvey would sit in a rickety old chair, wasting away, staring into space and drooling on herself. Health agents arrived and quickly called an ambulance. Paramedics had to do an obstacle course over old furniture and piles of junk. Hilza had a range of illnesses, and a broken hip. Helen had several infected ulcers. Hilza was hospitalized for a few weeks, then taken to a nursing home, where she died shortly afterward, at the end of July. Helen was treated for infected ulcers and eventually made a full recovery. The RSPCA removed the cats and dogs from the house, and Hobart City Council ordered a mandatory cleanup of the place. The task fell to Martin and his father, Maurice, who took long service leave from his job at the docks. The cleanup took 3 months. They filled several dozen skips, that's to say, dumpsters, with garbage. They used gardening tools to scrape the dried layers of grime, mold, and other filth from the walls and floorboards. Once the house was completely cleared out, Helen and Martin moved back in together and began accumulating junk again. The cycle at 30 Clare Street began anew. The odd couple also went through a dozen more cars. However, one habit did not resurface. The RSPCA banned Helen Harvey from keeping any more animals on the property. In 1991, Martin had to be reassessed by a psychologist to maintain his disability pension, which he was still collecting, despite living with the wealthy Helen. The shrink again found that Martin was intellectually disabled and unable to hold down a regular job. The psychologist also attached the following note to his analysis that portrays a much darker picture. Father protects him from any occasion that might upset him, as he continually threatens violence. Martin tells me he would like to go around shooting people. It is unsafe to let Martin out of his parents' control. Maurice Bryant felt that this assessment confirmed his fears. He knew that Martin would be unable to cope after his death and would likely run into trouble. He wrote up a will, splitting the house between his children, Martin and Lindy, upon Maurice and his wife's passing. Maurice also bequeathed his $250,000 superannuation pension to Martin, in the hopes the money would be used to hire a caretaker. Maurice must have spoken to Helen Harvey about all this, because 3 weeks later, she also drew up a will, leaving all of her property and her considerable investment income to Martin. Upon both of their deaths, Martin Bryant, a high school dropout, unable to hold a job, stood to become a wealthy man. The Country Squire. In late 1991, Helen and Martin moved to a 29-hectare farm near the village of Copping, about 45 minutes' drive east of Hobart, so they could own animals again. In addition to cats and dogs, they also purchased horses, ponies, and a pig, the last of which shared a room with Martin. To say that the animals were poorly looked after is an understatement. Feeding was irregular, grooming and washing non-existent. Neither Helen nor Martin knew what they were doing. Feces inevitably piled up. One local spotted a herd of horses starving in a bare paddock, while the paddock next to them was green with grass. On their frequent trips into Copping, Helen and Martin would leave a gaggle of cats and dogs in the back seat. More than once, locals saw a pony relaxing in the back of the car instead. Meanwhile, Martin started dressing in tweed blazers like a country squire, topped off with a silk cravat, lizard skin shoes, and a Panama hat. When the neighbors, Mrs. Featherstone and her 16-year-old daughter, arrived at the farm to greet the new arrivals, Helen invited them inside and instructed Martin to make them a cup of tea. He did so, served it to them, and then promptly told the two women to get out. Helen told the Featherstones to ignore him, but they quickly finished their tea and left. Following them outside, Martin said to the women, "Don't come back here again, or I'll shoot you." Martin started carrying his air rifle with him wherever he went, and took delight in firing upon tourists who stopped to buy apples at a fruit stall on the highway near the farm. He would also roam the countryside at night, shooting the air rifle at dogs that barked at him. Martin would occasionally take the bus into Hobart or Port Arthur instead of driving, and he would harass the bus driver and other passengers, particularly young women. Eventually, bus drivers just didn't stop for Martin, and he'd chase after the vehicle, screaming and swearing. Needless to say, the locals went out of their way to avoid Martin. Things got so bad that the owner of the neighboring farm, John Featherstone, told his wife and children to avoid Martin Bryant at all costs. And he relayed a message to Martin via Helen that, if Featherstone ever saw Martin on his property, he would shoot him, and not with an air rifle. As a wealthy eccentric, Helen Harvey was tolerated by the villagers in Copping, though rumors abounded about the nature of her relationship with Martin. She told people the truth, that Martin was quote-unquote simple, but did not get on with his father, so she looked after him as her ward. Whenever Martin acted inappropriately, which was often, it was Helen who would bring him by to apologize. Sometimes Martin would say sorry, but didn't seem to mean it, and sometimes Martin would simply shake the person's hand and not utter a word. The rare visitor to Helen and Martin's farm, those who were not threatened with violence or ignored it, noticed that the place was a mess, with animal feces and trash on the floor, and with fat wads of cash strewn around the house, on bookshelves and in empty ice cream containers. Although Helen was the more harmless of the two, the general consensus around Copping was that both of them were nuts. After nearly a year of this, on October 20th, 1992, Helen and Martin were returning by car to Copping after buying groceries and animal feed in the town of Sorel. They had 3 dogs in the back seat. Helen was driving. About 2 kilometers from the village, the car suddenly veered into oncoming traffic and smashed directly into another vehicle. Helen's neck was snapped, and she died instantly. Martin received severe neck and back injuries and spent 7 months recovering in hospital. 2 of the dogs in the back seat were killed, and the other one survived with minor injuries. Although this has never been confirmed, it is likely that Martin had caused the accident by doing his bizarre joke of suddenly yanking the steering wheel while Helen was trying to drive. It would explain the car suddenly careening into traffic. Given that Martin could also have been killed, it was unlikely to have been attempted murder, but rather Martin had acted erratically, without full understanding of the consequences, like he always did. At a stroke, 25-year-old Martin Bryant became a wealthy man, inheriting Helen Harvey's domestic real estate assets of $1.2 million in modern money, along with a huge investment income of $450,000 a year. While Martin recuperated in hospital, Maurice took over the running of the farm, cleaning the place up and disposing of most of the animals, either by selling them or shooting them. Maurice told the neighbors that he was just winding things up at the farm, and Martin would not be returning. In May 1993, Martin left hospital and briefly stayed at his parents' house before moving into Helen's old mansion at 30 Clare Street in Hobart, alone. Martin felt the loss of Helen keenly. In order to replace the companionship, Martin began pestering children as young as 9 to play games with him. However, the kids weren't having it. One neighbor recalled, "The kids were wary of him. They understood instinctively that he was someone to stay away from. He was just a little scary." In the aftermath of Helen's death, Maurice Bryant fell into a depression. The burden of dealing with his increasingly deranged son had fallen solely on him again. He visited a doctor and got a prescription for prothidin, a tricyclic antidepressant. Maurice also made moves to remove his son's control over his considerable fortune. Under the Mental Health Act, Maurice applied to have the money transferred to a group of trustees who would dole out the money to Martin and make it last for his entire lifetime. The paperwork was completed in late 1993, under the supervision of Martin's mother, Carlene. Meanwhile, Maurice put all his bank accounts in his wife's name and signed the accounts for the house utilities over to her. On August 13th, 1993, Maurice Bryant drove to the farm in Copping. At 7:30 p.m., he phoned his wife in Hobart and told her he loved her. He phoned his daughter, Lindy, in Queensland, and told her the same. He did not make a call to his son. The next morning, August 14th, a local arrived at the farm to buy a horse trailer that Maurice was selling off. He saw a note pinned to the front door that read, "Call the police." The man did so, and shortly afterward, Constable Gary Whittle arrived at the farm to find no one there. Aside from the note, there was nothing amiss, though Whittle did find a bag containing several $1,000s in a vehicle. A search party was arranged for Maurice Bryant, involving police and the local fire department. Maurice Bryant's body was not found anywhere in the house or in the fields. On August 15th, the search was widened to the surrounding hills, but still without success. On August 16th, divers were brought in to search the 4 dams that were on the property. Maurice Bryant's body was found in the dam nearest to the farmhouse, submerged in about 3 meters of water. He had a diving belt wrapped like a bandolier across his torso. He had heavily sedated himself with 18 30-milligram tablets of an anti-anxiety drug called Seropax and drowned himself. The death of Helen Harvey in 1992 and Maurice Bryant in 1993 removed the last strong constraints on Martin Bryant's erratic and often threatening behavior. His mother, Carlene, remained in his life, but she was not a disciplinarian who could enact a measure of control. And although Maurice Bryant had hoped that some of Martin's fortune would go toward a caregiver, this did not transpire. Martin spent his considerable monthly stipend on whatever he liked. So he drifted and was lonely, and his mental health continued to deteriorate. The full force of the psychopathy and stupidity of Martin Bryant, with all its attendant and potential menace, was about to be unleashed upon the world. Creep. Although Maurice's death was very likely a suicide, almost everyone in Copping suspected Martin of killing his father. It did not help that during the search, Martin did not seem distressed and spent the time idly brush-cutting the grass while other people were searching. People in Copping accused Martin to his face, making him feel the full extent of the community's rejection. Martin later sold the Copping farm for $143,000, or $312,000 in modern money, and continued to live at 30 Clare Street in Hobart. The $143,000, most notably, managed to escape the control of Martin's trustees under the Mental Health Act. It gave him a bit of mad money, on top of his regular stipend. After his father's death, Martin Bryant began drinking heavily. He was merely a social drinker before, but now he began consuming large quantities alone. In keeping with his childlike personality, Martin's favorite beverages were sweet drinks like port, Baileys, and Sambuca, the last of which reminded him of the taste of licorice. Over the next 2 years, his average consumption gradually escalated to half a bottle of Sambuca consumed at breakfast, and an entire bottle of Baileys consumed throughout the day. To this, he added a smattering of other sweet wines and liqueurs. And although Martin was once fined by police for driving without a license, by some miracle, he was never caught in a DUI. Gradually, he began to fixate on David and Noeline Martin, elderly owners of several guest houses and B&Bs in the countryside, as the people responsible for his father's death. Maurice Bryant had tried to purchase Seascape Guest House in 1992, but David and Noeline had beaten him to it. When Maurice had tried to purchase another guest house off them, they refused the sale. Maurice had made a comment to his son that David and Noeline were hogging the market. Martin Bryant must have attached undue weight to that statement and began thinking of David and Noeline as evil people, villains in a Disney film. When Maurice died, Martin somehow made a connection in his mind that David and Noeline were somehow at fault. A month after Maurice killed himself, Martin Bryant bumped into a woman named Marion Larner in downtown Hobart. Marion was a married woman several years Martin's senior, who lived on a farm with her husband, Roger, nearby the Port Arthur Historic Site. Martin had first met the Larners as a 13-year-old boy when the Bryant family made a day trip out there. Meeting her again as a 25-year-old man, Martin began to fixate on Marion. Over the next few weeks, he bombarded her with seemingly friendly phone calls. But the frequency of the calls got so bad that Marion contacted the police. The cops got in touch with Martin and gave him a warning. The calls abruptly stopped. In general, Martin Bryant got rather aggressive in his pursuit of women after his father's death, perhaps spurred on by the booze. He would constantly approach women in public, with his opening line being, "Would you like to have dinner with me?" Most often Martin was rejected or was given a fake number, but occasionally a woman would let Martin buy her a meal and then never contact him again. Given what the dinner conversation was likely to have been with Martin Bryant, you can't exactly blame them. Waitresses and shop assistants in downtown Hobart became familiar with Martin and were reluctant to serve him due to the things he'd say. For example, he once asked a waitress about the ice cream they had on the menu, and then leaned in and whispered that he'd like to lick it from her body. Another time, Martin approached a heavily pregnant woman in a shopping mall and began stroking her belly. He was eventually banned from that mall. In December 1993, Martin used a bit of his money to travel to Melbourne for the first time, and then traveled on to Singapore, where he stayed in a luxurious hotel for 3 days. Returning home, Martin discovered that he had some new neighbors, the Kuiper family, Harry and Anitra, and their 3 children. Although they had heard numerous rumors about Martin, in conversation they merely got the impression that he was quite simple in the head. So they decided, quote, "The Christian thing to do was to treat him like anybody else until he gave us reason to do otherwise." For the first 8 weeks, things went relatively well. Anitra Kuiper took note that Martin conducted conversation like a 2-year-old. Half the time he wouldn't respond to a question or statement and would just bring up something entirely unrelated. But he seemed harmless, like a puppy. He had a childlike smile and frequently giggled. For his part, Martin forbore from tormenting animals, being sexually suggestive, or making any serious threats of violence in Anitra's presence. Martin also socialized with the Kuiper's 3 kids, who were 13, 11, and 9. He gave them full run of his yard and the inside of his house. He went to Kmart and bought them all $26 water guns, or $55 in modern money, so they could all stage water fights in the garden together. Several times, Martin took the 3 kids and Anitra into Hobart and treated them all to a shopping spree, just like Helen used to do with him. And then he bought them all ice cream and took them to the movies. Martin's mother, Carlene, who knew him better than anyone, got wind of this and phoned Anitra to tell her that she shouldn't let Martin drive them anywhere and to not let the kids get too close to him. Carlene did not supply a clear reason, but from that point forward, Anitra started insisting on driving them all on their shopping trips herself, and she would not let the kids go over to Martin's house for longer than 20 minutes unobserved. Nevertheless, Martin's fixation on the Kuiper kids grew, particularly on their 13-year-old daughter. After 8 weeks had elapsed, with the 3 kids being Martin's best friends, they were over at his house and he suggested they play a game of cards. He produced a deck of cards that had pornographic images on them. When the kids told their parents, Harry Kuiper went over and told Martin to stop hanging around them. Martin said, "I suppose my mother's been phoning you." Harry replied, "No, Martin, we really like you. You're very generous to the kids. But we can't have you showing them pornography. It's not anything your mother has done. It's what you did." Martin wouldn't accept it, and over the next 2 months he tried to reestablish relations. One time he knocked on the Kuipers' front door and gave Anitra flowers. Another time, less harmlessly, he asked if he could take their 13-year-old daughter to dinner. And whenever he saw the kids out in the neighborhood, he would wave and suggest they come over sometime. The kids would reply positively, but never went over to Martin's house. They had firm instructions to give him a wide berth. The kids, even the young 9-year-old, understood that Martin was not quite right in the head. And so, Martin Bryant was alone again. He started frequenting a local cafe for afternoon tea, dressed in a linen suit with his Panama hat and lizard skin shoes. He also brought with him an empty briefcase and told the servers that he was an important businessman who earned $800 a week. After tea, Martin returned home to get ready for dinner at a North Hobart restaurant he always frequented. He wore an electric blue suit and ruffled shirt with flared trousers. He again repeated the lie that he was an important businessman. The owner recalled, quote, "It was horrible. Everyone was laughing at him, even the customers. I suddenly felt really sorry for him. I realized this guy didn't have any friends. He was like a child, trying to impress everybody. He struck me as an eager sort of young guy, like a Labrador puppy." In April 1994, a couple months after things fell apart with the Kuipers, Martin spent some of his money on a round-the-world trip to Melbourne, Bangkok, London, Stockholm, and Los Angeles, before flying home on May 7th. He had booked 2 weeks in Disneyland, but left after the 3rd day when it rained. From April 1994 to December 1995, Martin Bryant visited Europe 6 times, the USA 3 times, and Southeast Asia 3 times, along with making single trips to New Zealand and Japan. He joined a frequent flyer program and traveled business class. He also made a dozen domestic trips to Queensland, New South Wales, and South Australia. But his favorite place in the country was to visit Melbourne, where he apparently liked to visit the zoo. While staying in the UK, Martin checked into an expensive hotel. A few minutes later, Martin came down from the room and announced it was too hot and he was checking out. When the staff offered to fix the cooling for him, he refused. When they offered him a refund, Martin told them they could keep it as a tip. The unusual behavior was reported to the police. They contacted authorities in Tasmania to run a background check on Martin. They were told that Martin had been fined for driving without a license, but otherwise had a clean record. Another time, when returning to Tasmania from the United States, some of his bags got lost and wound up in Melbourne. Customs officers examined the luggage and seized 4 pornographic videos depicting bestiality. Martin Bryant later told a psychologist that his favorite part of traveling was the long flights. Not the destinations, landmarks, or swanky hotels, but the 20-odd hours in the air. To quote psychiatrist Dr. Paul Mullen, "It transpired that the attraction of the long airplane journey was that he could speak to the people next to him, who presumably, being trapped in their seats, had no choice but to at least appear friendly to him." Let that sink in. Martin Bryant was willing to pay thousands of dollars to spend a few hours talking to someone who was more or less compelled to be nice to him. He had been an outcast at school and lost the only friend he had by threatening the boy with violence. He was an outcast as a young adult, and after Helen Harvey's death, he'd lost the only person who ever really tolerated him. The rest of his existence consisted of his bizarre and sometimes menacing behavior alienating people. Low-functioning congenital psychopathy aside, Martin Bryant was lonely and couldn't understand what he was doing wrong. Bryant himself said he was suicidal around this time. It seems like if mental health authorities had recognized the problem and intervened with regular therapy and medication, the grisly and tragic end to Martin Bryant's case might well have been avoided. Once, when Martin was flying home from London, he was seated next to a 23-year-old female law student at the University of Tasmania. Apparently, the conversation was not a total disaster, and she was friendly with him the whole time. Martin alternated between telling the woman he was a farmer or a carpenter, but couldn't keep his story straight. He said he hadn't worked since his father's death. At the end of their conversation, Martin invited the young woman to come live with him in a big house on Clare Street. After the flight, he phoned his mother and told her he'd met the woman he was going to marry. But, needless to say, the young law student did not move into Clare Street. Prior to another one of his trips, Martin called the travel agency and asked what the rules were about carrying firearms on airplanes. The travel agent told Martin to call the airport to get the precise information. He did so, and his call was reported to the police. Given his mental health record, with its many sinister notes and warnings, it is unlikely that Martin could ever have gotten a license and purchased a gun. Not that he ever tried. Instead, Martin was purchasing weapons under the table from vendors by paying them a premium in cash. For instance, Martin later divulged that he had bought his AR-15 for $5,000 or $10,650 in modern Australian money, about 5 or 6 times the going rate for a mid-tier model in America. He did target practice in the countryside by shooting at trees. In 1995, Martin got himself a girlfriend. She was a 16-year-old school leaver named Janetta. Martin was 27. They had met because their mothers attended the same church. To be clear, the age of consent in Tasmania at the time was 16. But there was certainly a stigma against a man in his late 20s dating a teenager. Martin tried to buy Janetta's affections, showering her with expensive gifts and taking her on trips. He refrained from discussing or threatening violence. To Janetta, Martin was just a tall, blonde, rich, and incredibly stupid young man. He was quiet. He was gentle. He was oddly childish. One time, when they were in Sydney, Martin pretended to read the Age newspaper in an attempt to seem intelligent. Janetta knew he was just trying to impress her and went along with it. Another time, Martin and Janetta made a day trip south of Hobart in a small boat. They were just pottering around the coastline with no clear destination in mind. The boat engine broke down, and the current started to take them further and further from shore. Martin panicked and burst into tears, screaming that he didn't want to die. Janetta, the 16-year-old girl, kept calm and comforted him until they were rescued. On a trip to Surfer's Paradise in Queensland, Martin proposed to Janetta, who refused. She told him point blank that he was a bit too dim and reckless and they couldn't build a future together. She broke up with Martin after the trip. They occasionally ran into each other in Hobart. Martin always asked Janetta to dinner. She always said no. Janetta was Martin's first and last long-term girlfriend before his brief fling with Petra Wilmot in the autumn of 1996, just before all hell broke loose. Countdown to Armageddon. Sometime in early 1996, Martin Bryant drove out to Seascape Guest House on the edge of the Tasman Peninsula, roughly 80 minutes east of Hobart. There, he met David and Noeline Martin, who owned the house, along with several other holiday properties in the area. The purpose of his visit, Bryant revealed, was to buy Seascape, just like his father had attempted to do in 1992. David and Noeline said they weren't interested in selling the place. Martin pressed them and offered them a huge sum of money, many times what the property was worth. In his mind, he was trying to correct a wrong that had led to his father's death. Noeline replied that they weren't interested in selling, no matter how much money Martin offered them. We do not know what Martin's reaction was, or whether he threatened violence. What we do know is, sometime after the encounter, Martin Bryant decided to murder David and Noeline. In early March 1996, Martin placed a classified ad in the newspaper searching for a gardener for 30 Clare Street. One of the people who answered the ad was 20-year-old TAFE student Petra Wilmot. She thought it would be an easy way to earn a little extra money. Martin hired her, and, before she had even so much as pushed a leaf, asked her out. Martin splashed less cash on Petra than on Janetta, and he didn't take her on any fancy trips outside Tasmania, just a few drives into the countryside. Martin was also careful not to fly into a temper or discuss violence around Petra. As far as she knew, Martin was just a gentle, quiet young man. They genuinely seemed to enjoy each other's company. On March 13th, 1996, news circulated around the world of the Dunblane Massacre in Scotland. Former shopkeeper and suspected pedophile Thomas Watt Hamilton had used 2 Browning pistols and 2 Smith & Wesson revolvers, along with 743 rounds of ammunition, to murder 16 children, all 5 years old, and 1 teacher at a primary school, before turning the gun on himself. It is theorized that the news of the Dunblane Massacre inspired Martin Bryant to commit a similar crime of his own. He wanted to murder David and Noeline, and he was feeling suicidal at the time. Bryant concluded that if he was going to murder 2 people and effectively end his life, he might as well make as big an impact on the world as possible by taking a bunch of strangers with him. Forensic psychologists hypothesize that the reason why shooters do this is for a feeling of power, to feel like they are leaving the world as a notorious and fearsome villain, rather than as the failure of a human being that they really are. According to Bryant's stunted and addled mind, he had a justification for murdering David and Noeline. They were responsible for his father's death. But there was no such justification for murdering a bunch of strangers. Martin's congenital psychopathy took care of that. He felt no empathy for them. They weren't innocent human beings. They were targets. A way for Martin to make his mark upon the world. Besides, most people in Martin's life had rejected him. Martin was incapable of reflecting that it was because of something he had done. Inappropriate comments, threats of violence, shooting people with an air rifle, and so forth. In Martin's mind, people rejected him because they were cold, wicked, and cruel. So, as far as Martin was concerned, everyone on the planet was fair game. He ignored the fact that several people in his own life, his parents, Helen Harvey, the Kuiper family, Petra Wilmot, had been kind to him. It did not occur to him that among the people he might kill, there could be others equally capable of kindness and understanding. Sometime in early April 1996, one of Martin Bryant's neighbors in Newtown, Nancy Dalton, ran into Martin while she was waiting for a taxi in front of the Purity supermarket. Nancy had known Martin from the neighborhood for several years and always felt sorry for him. She knew he felt alienated and lonely. And so, whenever she saw him out and about, she would take the time to have a chat. This time was no different. During their conversation, Martin suddenly said, "Come on a picnic with me this weekend. We could go for a nice drive. I could take you for lunch. I'll show you where Miss Harvey had a farm." Nancy politely declined, explaining that her grandchildren were visiting her that weekend. Sensing his frustration, Nancy asked if something was wrong. Martin replied, "I don't know. Nobody ever wants to listen to me or go with me. I'm getting fed up with this. I'll think of something. Something. Everybody will remember me." Nancy began to assure Martin that she would go with him for a picnic if she could, but Martin had already walked away and was hurrying towards his yellow Volvo. On April 25th, 1996, Martin and Petra spent Anzac Day together in the countryside at Richmond Historical Site. Although he and Petra had an enjoyable day, he seemed irritated by the tourists there. On the 26th, Martin and Petra had lunch in central Hobart. On April 27th, they went to a farmer's market and bought vegetables. That evening, they went to Carleen Bryant's house for dinner. Carleen used the vegetables Martin and Petra had bought that day. Neither woman noticed anything particularly amiss with Martin, at least not more than usual. After dinner, Martin and Petra went dancing at the Cadillac Club and left sometime around midnight. Returning to 30 Clare Street, Martin set his alarm clock for 6 a.m. This was unusual. Martin never set his alarm clock. On April 28th, 1996, over breakfast, Martin explained to Petra that he had something to do that day. Petra left 30 Clare Street at around 8 a.m. Martin's usual practice was to drink half a bottle of Sambuca with breakfast, when Petra wasn't there to catch him, of course. His alcoholism had intensified over the past 6 months, averaging about 20 to 30 standard units every 24 hours. But today, he remained dead sober. He left the house, taking his sports bag containing 2 semi-automatic rifles, a bolt-action hunting rifle, and a 12-gauge shotgun with him. The bag also contained handcuffs, a hunting knife, rope, gasoline cans, a camcorder, and several boxes of ammunition. Martin got into his yellow Volvo and drove to Seascape Guest House, making 4 stops in various small towns along the way. He arrived at Seascape at 11:15 a.m. He shot 69-year-old Noeline Martin as she opened the door. Then he charged into the house and stabbed 72-year-old David Martin with his hunting knife. David probably watched as Bryant caved in his wife's skull with an unidentified blunt object. Then Bryant shot David in the head. He closed the door to the cottage and dragged the 2 corpses into a nearby bedroom, placing them on the bed. At 12:30 p.m., Maureen and John Mason, 2 tourists from mainland Australia, pulled up the gravel drive to Seascape Guest House. Bryant came outside and greeted them. He seemed agitated. His mannerisms were odd. The Masons explained that they had enjoyed their time in Tasmania so much that they wanted to inquire about prices at Seascape for a subsequent holiday. They also wanted to inspect the rooms of the cottage. Bryant said they couldn't come inside. He lied that his mother and father had gone out and that, quote, "I've got my girlfriend inside." Disappointed and slightly annoyed, the Masons got back into their car. As they drove away, Bryant stood on the front doorstep, his arms folded, watching them. Once the Masons were out of sight, Bryant locked the cottage, got into his Volvo, and tossed the keys to Seascape into his glove box. A short distance down the Arthur Highway, Bryant pulled over and spoke to 2 young women who were having car trouble. He told them that he was, quote, "going to the Isle of the Dead to get rid of some wasps." The Isle of the Dead was a 1-hectare island off Port Arthur, where there was a small convict graveyard. And by wasps, according to later reports, Bryant didn't mean insects. He meant the slang for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Bryant bought some pot from the 2 women and suggested they meet up later in Port Arthur and hang out. Then he drove on his merry way, leaving the 2 women to sort out the car for themselves. At 12:45 p.m., Bryant arrived at the outskirts of the Port Arthur Historic Site. Here he pulled onto Palmer's Lookout Road and stopped at the farmhouse of Roger Larner. Bryant spoke to Roger about buying some cattle from him, then mused about buying Seascape from the Martins. Then Bryant asked if he could say hello to Roger's wife, Marion. This set off alarm bells in Roger's mind. Bryant had run into Marion Larner in Hobart 3 years earlier, in 1993, and afterward had bombarded Marion with phone calls until the cops told Bryant to stop. And so, with this in mind, Roger said he'd accompany Bryant to the farmhouse, while the latter said hello to his wife. Bryant's smile faded, and he muttered something about coming back later. He got back into his Volvo and sped away. The road into the Port Arthur historic site was slow going. It was littered with cars and tour buses. After arguing with an information guide about where he could park, Bryant pulled into a spot on the waterfront at 1:25 p.m. He got out of his car, taking his large, heavy sports bag with him. He walked into the Broad Arrow Cafe, where 60 people were having lunch. He strolled up to the counter and ordered a tray of food, a soda, and a cup of fruit juice. He headed out to the patio, ate, and drank. A Melbourne couple sitting near him heard Bryant muttering about wasps and how there weren't many Japanese tourists there that day. After finishing his lunch, Bryant went back into the cafe, placed his big bag of guns on a vacant table in the corner, and unzipped it. The Port Arthur Massacre. Sitting 2 tables away from Martin Bryant were Mick Sargent, his girlfriend Kate Scott, and their friend Caroline Villiers. They were visiting from Perth. Mick Sargent had observed Bryant walk into the restaurant and wondered why anyone would carry around such a heavy bag with them. Sargent saw Bryant unzip the bag, take out a camcorder, turn it on, and place it on the table in front of him. It was at this point that Sargent caught Bryant's eye. By Sargent's reckoning, the 2 men stared each other down for about 10 to 15 seconds, each unwilling to look away. Sargent thought that Bryant looked pissed off and could tell that he wasn't completely right in the head. Then his girlfriend, Kate Scott, said something to Sargent, and he looked back at her. When Sargent glanced up again, he saw that Bryant was now staring at a Malaysian couple who were eating at the table next to him. The next thing Mick Sargent heard was gunfire. The following series of events happened in the next 15 seconds. The Malaysian couple were hit first. Mo Yi-ing was shot through the head. So instantaneous was his death that he was later found still clutching the knife with which he was eating. Su Leng Chung was shot through the head next. The third shot was aimed at Mick Sargent's head. It grazed his scalp. A fourth shot penetrated the head of his girlfriend, Kate Scott, killing her instantly. Next, Bryant aimed his AR-15 at Melbourne tourist Anthony Nightingale, who managed to shout, "No, no, not here!" before he was shot through the neck, killing him. His body slumped against the cafe window, alarming tourists standing outside, who had briefly thought that the gunfire was part of some sort of historical reenactment. Bryant then turned the gun on brothers Kevin and Ray Sharp and their friend Wally Bennett, who were visiting from Victoria. Wally was shot through the neck, and the bullet passed through him and also killed Ray. Kevin was then shot twice, including once in the head, killing him as well. All 3 men had been facing away from Bryant, and they did not know what was going on. 3 of their friends, also eating at the table, Gary Broom, John Fiddler, and his wife Gay, were hit by flying bullet fragments and severely wounded. At another table, Tony Kiston and his wife Sarah stood up in alarm. Tony quickly pushed Sarah out the nearby door. Before he could follow her, Tony was shot in the back of the head and killed. Beside Tony was Andrew Mills, who had moved from Sydney to Hobart to set up a bed and breakfast. He was shot through the head a split second later. 2 children's camp counselors, Thelma Walker and Pamela Law, were struck by the bullet fragments from these shots, and then their friend, Peter Crosswell, dragged them from their chairs to the floor to take cover. Another woman, Patricia Barker, was also hit with bullet fragments as she dove under the table. Bryant next turned his rifle on Graham Collier, his friend Carolyn Lawton, and Carolyn's teenage daughter, Sarah. They were just rising from the table to make their escape. Graham was shot through the jaw, but was not killed. Carolyn threw herself on top of her daughter to protect her, but Sarah had already been shot through the head and killed. Carolyn was shot in the back and survived after intensive surgery, but it wasn't until 24 hours later that she learned that her daughter was dead. Bryant then swiveled around and shot Victorian tourist Mervyn Howard through the head. The bullet continued and pierced one of the cafe windows. Then Bryant shot his wife, Mary, in the throat. He leaned over an empty baby stroller and shot her in the head at point-blank range, killing her. At this point, Bryant moved through the cafe in the direction of the adjoining gift shop. Robert Elliott came out from under the table where he was hiding to make a dash for the door. Bryant shot him in the arm and the head. Elliott was badly injured, but was not killed. 17 shots, 15 seconds, 12 dead, 10 wounded. Entering the gift shop, Bryant immediately opened fire on the two young women behind the counter, 17-year-old Nicole Burgess and 26-year-old Elizabeth Howard. Both were killed. Meanwhile, Victorian tourist Dennis Lever pushed his wife, Coralie, and their friend, Vera Jerry, behind a clothing display before, a second later, he was killed by a single shot to the head. Next, Bryant killed Gwen Neander while she was trying to run to the exit. Another 5 people had made it to the same exit, only to discover that the door would not open. Bryant did not open fire on them because he was momentarily distracted by movement from the cafe. Bryant walked over to the cafe entrance and fired on Jason Winter, who had stood up from his hiding place, hitting him in the chest and then in the head, killing him. Winter managed to utter the words, "No, no," before he died. Bullet fragments from these shots hit American tourist Dennis Olson, injuring his scalp, hand, chest, and blinding him in one eye. Bryant then fired impulsively at one of the tabletops. The bullet passed through the table and hit Peter Crosswell, who was sheltering on the floor with his 2 friends. The bullet hit him in the buttocks. Meanwhile, cafe employee Bridget Cook had escaped through the kitchen exit and began shouting at tourists to flee from the area. She continued on her way through the parking lot, warning people. Bryant walked back into the gift shop. 5 people were still pressed up against the exit door, which would not open. Ron Jerry, whose wife was hiding behind the clothing display a few feet away, Pauline Masters, Peter and Carolyn Nash, and an unidentified Asian male tourist. Peter Nash had lain down on top of his wife Carolyn to protect her. Bryant opened fire on all 5 of them. Ron Jerry, Pauline Masters, and Peter Nash were all killed. Carolyn Nash, lying underneath her husband, was miraculously unharmed. Bryant tried to shoot the unidentified Asian male tourist, but discovered his rifle was out of ammunition. He walked over to the gift shop counter, took out a fresh clip, and reloaded. He left the empty clip on the counter. Rather than kill the remaining 2 people by the exit, he walked back into the cafe, retrieved his camcorder, slung the sports bag over his shoulder, and walked calmly out of the building. 29 shots, 90 seconds, 20 dead, 12 wounded. Bryant stood on the steps of the cafe, taking pot shots at people in the parking lot. Bus driver Royce Thompson was hit in the back, fell to the ground, and crawled under a bus for cover. He later died of his wounds. Cafe employee Bridget Cook was struck in the right leg, and the bullet lodged in her thigh. Winifred Applin was running for cover inside a bus when she was shot in the side and killed. Her friend, Yvonne Lockley, had a bullet graze her cheek before she leapt onto that same bus. Next, Bryant shot Janet Quinn in the back. She fell to the ground, paralyzed. Another shot hit Doug Hitchinson in the arm, and he fell to the ground, Then Bryant walked over to his yellow Volvo. He swapped from his AR-15 to his SLR semi-automatic rifle. Then Bryant got in the car and sat in the driver's seat for a few seconds, perhaps thinking about what he would do next. Then he got out of the car and took some pot shots at some tourists on the other side of the parking lot. None of the shots hit anyone, and a few of the bullets embedded into the trees. Bryant walked over to where Janet Quinn lay on the ground. He shot her again in the back. Bryant climbed onto a bus, but, finding it empty, he fired out the window at another bus, killing South African tourist Elva Gaylard and hitting Adelaide tourist Gordon Francis in the shoulder as he tried to pull the bus door shut. Meanwhile, Neville Quinn, husband of Janet Quinn, had fled toward the waterfront. He now returned to search for his wife. He found her lying next to a bus, slowly dying. He knelt by her side and clasped her hand in his. Bryant opened fire on him. The bullets missed. Neville scrambled to get inside a nearby bus. Bryant followed him aboard. He found Neville Quinn hiding between the two seats. Bryant raised his SLR and said, "No one gets away from me." Realizing that Bryant was about to fire, Neville Quinn shrank down further between the seats. A split second later, the bullet tore through his neck. Thinking Neville was dead, Bryant got off the bus. He walked back to his yellow Volvo. As he moved, he fired upon American tourist James Velasco, who was some distance away, filming the massacre with his video camera. The bullet missed. Bryant got into his car and pulled out of the parking lot. Despite being gravely injured, Neville Quinn managed to stagger off the bus, bleeding profusely from the neck. He returned to where his wife, Janet, lay on the ground. She died in his arms. 12 minutes, 24 dead, 16 wounded. A swarm of panicked tourists were running up Jetty Road toward the toll booth at the entrance to the historical site. Among them was 36-year-old Nanette Mikach, who was carrying her 3-year-old daughter, Madeline, and her 6-year-old daughter, Alana, was running beside her. As they approached the toll booth, Nanette said to Alana, "We're safe now, Pumpkin." Bryant's yellow Volvo came up behind them and stopped opposite of Nanette. Thinking that Bryant might be offering to drive them to safety, Nanette approached the vehicle. Bryant got out, wielding his SLR semi-automatic rifle. He placed a hand on Nanette's shoulder and told her to kneel. A cry went up amongst the crowd. "It's him!" And people scattered. Bryant killed Nanette and her 3-year-old daughter Madeline. He fired 2 shots at 6-year-old Alana as she fled into the trees. They missed. So Bryant followed her, found her, and killed her. Bryant got back into his Volvo and pulled up to the toll booth at the entrance to Port Arthur Historic Site. His way was blocked by a burnished gold BMW driven by Jim Pollard, with passengers Mary Rose Nixon, Robert Salzman, and his wife Helene. Bryant got out of his Volvo without a weapon and approached the BMW. Not realizing the situation, Robert Salzman got out of the car and began yelling at Bryant for blocking the way. In response, Bryant returned to his Volvo, fetched his SLR, and shot Robert Salzman at point-blank range, killing him. Meanwhile, Jim Pollard had climbed out of the driver's side door and was also shot and killed moments later. Other drivers in the vicinity began to realize what was going on and put their cars into reverse. They sped away from the scene. Bryant dragged both Mary Rose Nixon and Helene Salzman from the BMW and executed them. Then he transferred the SLR, AR-15, a few boxes of ammunition, 2 pairs of handcuffs, and a can of gasoline to the BMW. He left behind in his yellow Volvo the bolt-action hunting rifle, the 12-gauge shotgun, more cans of gasoline, and the kindling. He also forgot the keys to Seascape guest house in the glove box. Before climbing into the BMW, Bryant fired one shot at a car driven by Graham Sutherland, which also contained his wife and 2 sons. The bullet smashed into the windscreen, but did not manage to injure anyone inside. Then Bryant got into the BMW and left the scene. 15 minutes, 31 dead, 16 wounded. The BMW pulled into the main street of Port Arthur, comprising of a few specialty shops, a gas station, and a general store. Some of the cars that had fled the toll booth area had pulled into the main street. One woman leapt out of her vehicle, ran into the gas station, and told the owner, Jim Laycock, to call the police. Laycock picked up the phone. As he did so, he saw a burnished gold BMW pull up to the gas station, blocking in a white Corolla driven by Glenn Pears with his girlfriend Zoe Hall in the passenger seat. In what Jim Laycock later described as the most frightening 2 minutes of my life, he watched as Bryant exited the BMW, carrying the AR-15, walked over to the passenger side of the Corolla, and tried to drag Zoe Hall out of the vehicle. Glenn Pears got out of the driver's side and was on his feet, ready to come to Zoe's aid. Bryant let Zoe go and aimed his rifle at Glenn. Bryant marched him at gunpoint to the BMW and forced the man into the trunk, slamming it shut. Meanwhile, Zoe Hall clambered into the driver's seat in the Corolla in an attempt to escape, but Bryant let off 3 shots through the windshield, killing her instantly. Then Bryant got into the BMW and drove away. He headed down the Arthur Highway in the direction of Seascape Guest House. Along the way, he opened fire out of the window at a passing Ford Falcon, shattering its windshield. A few minutes later, Bryant pulled into the gravel driveway at Seascape. He got out of the BMW with his rifle and stood by the road, shooting at passing vehicles. John Rook was driving a Datsun sedan, dragging a trailer. Bryant's bullets went wide and missed. Behind him was Linda White and her boyfriend Michael Wanders in a Holden 4x4. Bryant peppered the SUV with bullets, one of which struck Linda White in the arm, damn near severing it from her body. Then Bryant fired on a sedan driven by Doug Horn. The bullet shattered the windscreen, sending shards of glass into Horn's arms and chest. Broken glass showered the 3 other occupants in the vehicle. Additional bullets thankfully missed. Ann Wardle, following in another vehicle, saw the shots and threw her car into reverse. Bryant opened fire, hitting her side door. Meanwhile, a red sedan came up behind Ann, driven by Simon Williams and his wife, Susan, in the passenger seat. Simon swerved into the other lane and sped up to drive past the gunman. Bryant fired twice at the sedan, with one of the bullets piercing the passenger window and shattering Susan Williams's left hand, while her husband got sprayed with shrapnel. Ann Wardle, meanwhile, had managed to reverse down the highway, heading away from Port Arthur, out of sight of Bryant's gun. Ann Wardle leapt out of her vehicle and began flagging down oncoming cars, telling them to stop. A madman was on the loose. Bryant got back into the BMW and guided it up the gravel drive to the cottage entrance. He exited the vehicle, opened the trunk, and forced Glenn Pears out with the AR-15 pointing in his face. Bryant cuffed Glenn's hands behind his back. Then Bryant marched him toward the cottage door. Realizing that he had left the keys to Seascape in his Volvo, Bryant either kicked the door open or threw his body weight against it. He pushed Glenn Pears into the cottage and used the second pair of handcuffs to secure Pears to the thick stair rail. Bryant went back outside, retrieved his SLR and boxes of ammunition, and brought them inside. Then Bryant doused the BMW with a can of gasoline and set the car ablaze. He returned to the guest house, shut the door, and barricaded it. It had been approximately 30 minutes since Bryant had first unzipped his big bag of guns at the cafe. 32 dead, 23 wounded, 1 taken hostage. Add to that the bodies of David and Noeline Martin, already lying on a bed in Seascape guest house after being brutally murdered earlier that day, and the death toll rises to 34. Siege. Police constables Paul Hyland and Gary Whittle arrived at Seascape guest house just after 2 p.m. to find a BMW on fire in the driveway. No sooner did the officers exit their vehicle than Martin Bryant opened fire on them from Seascape's front window. The 2 constables retreated to a muddy ditch at the end of the driveway and crouched down as bullets whizzed all around them. The local cops were horrendously ill-equipped, only pistols against Bryant's 2 semi-automatic rifles. Bryant continued to pepper the top of the ditch with bullets while the officers radioed for help. Over the next 2 hours, over 500 officers, roughly half of Tasmania's police force, were deployed in a wide perimeter around the country cottage. The Melbourne Special Operations Group, the Aussie equivalent of SWAT, and additional police reinforcements were flown in from the mainland. A command post was set up in the nearby town of Tirana. Because of the range of Bryant's guns, the police did not assemble too close to Seascape. Constables Whittle and Hyland wound up spending 8 hours in the ditch in front of the house until they could be extracted under cover of darkness. Meanwhile, police negotiator Terry McCarthy, police psychologist Mike Ryan, and forensic psychologist Dr. Ian Sale phoned Seascape to talk to Bryant and figure out what they were dealing with here. The first call to Seascape went through at 4:30 p.m. Bryant answered the phone, said his name was Jamie, and lied that he had 3 hostages instead of just Glenn Pears. He did not divulge that the Martins were already dead. Bryant pretended to be taking food and water to the 3 hostages while he spoke to McCarthy on the phone. Bryant demanded a helicopter to fly him and Noeline Martin to Hobart, where he intended to board a flight to Adelaide. Of course, Noeline was already dead, and Bryant had no serious plan or intention to leave Seascape alive. McCarthy said that it might be difficult to procure a helicopter. Bryant responded by saying, "You can buy a helicopter. I've got the money. You don't understand. I've got the money." Then he related a long, rambling story about how he had once tried to buy a helicopter for $95,000, or roughly $200,000 today, when he saw one advertised in a Hobart newspaper. McCarthy asked Bryant how he was feeling. Bryant said, "Relaxed. It's just like being on a Hawaiian holiday." McCarthy asked why. Bryant answered, "I don't myself rightly know." McCarthy made 5 more telephone calls to Seascape Guest House between 5 and 9:30 p.m. During the course of their conversation, Bryant told McCarthy he thought that Noeline Martin was bad news, and she had prevented his father from purchasing a property in the area. When McCarthy brought up the shooting at Port Arthur, Bryant asked him with childlike interest, "How many people were hurt?" McCarthy did not give a direct answer. At the time, he did not know the total dead and wounded, even if he had wanted to satisfy Bryant's morbid curiosity. Bryant also threatened to kill his 3 hostages if police came up the drive or tried to storm the place. For their part, the cops had no way of knowing whether the 3 people were still alive. They would not risk trying to force the issue unless it became clear Bryant was murdering people inside the house. McCarthy's final call to Seascape was at 9:30 p.m., shortly after which the line went dead. It turned out Bryant was using a cordless phone and had merely neglected to charge the battery. Meanwhile, Bryant sporadically fired shots out of the cottage windows. He had a fairly wide view of the surrounding area. Not too many trees blocking his vantage, and fairly wide open gardens. a cloudless, moonlit sky to detect movement in the shadows. Police gave the cottage a wide berth because of the gunfire. The only vital operation was extracting the 2 trapped police officers at 10 p.m. When the team moved in, they kept their movements slow, slight, and close to the ground. The constables were rescued without the team being detected. Over the course of the night, Bryant fired 250 rounds in random directions. Bryant's guns went silent between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., while he presumably slept. Police still did not storm the house because they had no way of knowing for certain if Bryant was asleep or if the house was booby-trapped. And even if he was asleep, there was no guarantee that Bryant wouldn't have time to wake up and kill a hostage before he was cut down or apprehended. At 6 a.m., April 29th, 1996, the sporadic gunfire resumed. Bryant was obviously awake. Police settled in for the second day of the siege. Amidst the renewed gunfire out the windows, one of the shots may have gone off inside. At some point that morning, it is thought, Martin Bryant shot and killed his hostage, Glenn Pears. It is also possible that Pears was murdered at some point during the night. At 7:45 a.m., police noticed that smoke was billowing from the second floor of Seascape guest house. 10 minutes later, the fire spread to the ground floor. Bryant's ammunition started exploding in the heat. The fire might have spurred police to move in, but the combusting ammo sounded like gunfire, making it too risky to advance. It is likely that Bryant intended to die inside Seascape guest house. But the pain of burning to death proved too much. Instinct kicked in. At 8:15 a.m., Martin Bryant suddenly burst out of the front door, his clothes engulfed in flames. Bryant ran around the back of the house. He stripped off his burning clothes and reappeared at the front of the cottage, completely naked. He dropped to his knees on the lawn. Police moved in and cuffed his hands and legs. Then they carried him to a waiting ambulance. He was taken to Royal Hobart Hospital and treated under heavy guard. He had sustained second and third-degree burns to his legs, back, and buttocks. Meanwhile, Seascape Cottage continued to crackle and crumble. Firefighters were brought in. The inferno was eventually tamed. Investigators quickly found the charred remains of Glenn Pears, cuffed to a railing, and David and Noeline Martin lying together in one of the bedrooms. 35 dead, 23 wounded. Among the fatalities were 2 children. A giggling psychopath. In the months following his arrest, Martin Bryant's low intelligence, childlike naivety, and utter psychopathy were on full display. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Bryant denied being the gunman who carried out the Port Arthur massacre. The only thing he would admit to was the kidnap of Glenn Pears. The severity of the situation did not seem to dawn on him. Bryant thought that by denying the murders, he could wriggle out of things with a mild slap on the wrist, and he tackled police questioning as if he were a child who had landed in trouble at school. Of course, the cops had dozens of eyewitnesses, video footage, fingerprints, ballistics evidence identifying his guns, recovered fairly intact from Seascape as the murder weapons, and his Volvo was left at the scene. Never mind that the 4 passengers inside the BMW he had stolen were found dead at the entrance to the Port Arthur historic site. Yet Bryant falsely believed he was in the position and had the cognitive ability to play cat and mouse with the cops over the day's events. On the 4th of July, 1996, Bryant was brought into an interview room, his legs manacled and his arms cuffed to a wheelchair. He was subjected to an extensive interrogation that lasted several hours. Again, Bryant proved himself uncooperative. He just sat there, smiling and giggling, expressing patently false sympathy for the victims and issuing the occasional flimsy denial. He seemed to be enjoying the attention, and given that Bryant used to pay thousands of dollars to fly across the world just so he could talk to the plane passengers unlucky enough to be seated next to him, there did not seem to be a very high bar for the quality of the conversation. He did not seem to mind that the officers present were generally disgusted by him, occasionally frustrated and angry, and that they were accusing him of multiple murders. One of the detectives present asked, "Do you remember the 28th of April this year?" Bryant replied, "I don't. Was that the day I suppose everyone's talking about?" Police asked Bryant what he did after leaving 30 Clare Street that morning. Bryant replied, I went surfing that day." The cops asked if he made any stops on the Port Arthur Highway. Bryant admitted to stopping to get a coffee. He did not mention the other stops, and outright denied stopping in the town of Sorel to buy a bottle of ketchup. He laughed and shook his head. "What would I need a bottle of tomato sauce for?" To this day, we still don't know why the hell Bryant bought it, but there may not be a rational explanation. We aren't dealing with the most rational mind here. It is important to note that during his recovery in hospital and subsequent time spent in a jail cell, authorities tried to deprive Bryant of any information or media coverage about the massacre. At one point, during the interview, Bryant asked, "How many people died altogether there?" One of the detectives replied, "Including the people at Seascape, 35. At that point, Bryant's mouth dropped open, and he did a double take. He seemed pleased that the number was so high. He followed up with, "And how many people injured? Many?" "Quite a lot," came the answer. But that wasn't sufficient for Bryant. "How many is quite a lot?" "Approximately 20. Bryant's mouth dropped open again. He leaned forward and grinned, as if he could not believe his luck. He asked, "What, seriously or not?" Then he laughed. No remorse, barely recognizing that these were people. From Bryant's perspective, he had wanted to make an impact, to terrify society, and be seen as a villain. So all he heard was a high number, like it was a high score in a video game. The detective got irritated. "I've told you what you've done." Bryant looked back at him insolently. "What have I done?" The other detective interjected, "You killed 35 people." Bryant merely smiled, shook his head, and looked away. 2 more detectives were brought into the room. They continued to press him on the murders. Bryant continued to sit there, giggling. The detective said, "It's not funny, Martin. Why are you laughing?" Bryant shrugged. "I can't explain any of this. I don't know anything about the killings." "But it's not funny, is it?" "What isn't?" Bryant asked childishly. "What I told you about. So why are you laughing?" "Because it's good to get out of my cell," Bryant said, and he started laughing again. The cops brought forward an AR-15, the same model of gun used during the massacre. Bryant admitted to buying one under the table from a vendor named Terry Hill. Bryant answered a classified ad in the Hobart Mercury. He had bought the gun at a steep 500% markup and paid in cash. No record of the transaction. No need for Bryant to have a firearms license. Bryant added, "I wish I had that AR-15 in here. Then I'd probably be able to get out. Jump out the window and escape. Because I don't like being locked up." Bryant denied being the owner of the big blue sports bag found in the yellow Volvo left at the scene, containing boxes of ammunition and the 12-gauge shotgun. Despite witness testimony from the store clerk and his girlfriend seeing him buy such a bag, despite witnesses seeing him with it in the cafe, despite his fingerprints being on the bag, the ammo, and the shotgun, and all over the Volvo, Martin Bryant denied everything. The only crime Bryant would admit to was the kidnapping of Glenn Pears. But not his murder, nor the murder of his girlfriend. It required quite a few distortions and leaps of logic. Bryant claimed that Pears was driving the BMW that Bryant later torched outside Seascape. Of course, Bryant had stolen the BMW driven by Jim Pollard from the entrance to Port Arthur, killing all of its 4 occupants. Pears had been driving a Corolla. Bryant made no mention of Pears' girlfriend, Zoe Hall, whom he had murdered at the service station in full view of witnesses. As to why, in Bryant's version of events, he stole the BMW, he merely said, "I saw this car, right? And I liked it." Regarding Glenn Pears, a detective asked, "How did this guy get to be in the boot?" "Oh, I put him there. I had this gun, see? The AR-15. I pointed it in his face." Bryant provided no explanation as to why he had just randomly decided to steal a car and take someone hostage that day. After a moment's thought, he added, "See, if people didn't do these unfortunate things, you guys wouldn't have a job." Then he laughed. The detective replied, "Well, there's a lot of truth in that, mate, let me tell you." Bryant was shown a file folder full of images from the crime scenes at Port Arthur, including photographs of each of the 35 dead. Bryant's reaction was to pore over them, fascinated, gleeful, reveling in it. He started laughing. There was not a trace of regret. Frustrated, the detective slammed the folder shut and walked back to his seat. Bryant was asked, "What would you think about a person who has killed 35 people? What would be your opinion of that person?" Bryant looked at the detective insolently, rolling his eyes and looking at the ceiling. Then he said, "It's a wicked, awful, horrendous thing. Something like that. I don't know." "And they reckoned others were injured?" he asked, obviously relishing the moment. "Many injured. There's been 2 little babies shot. There have been many witnesses who have given very graphic description of you being responsible for killing those people." Bryant looked at the detective with a mixture of boredom and contempt while he repeatedly nodded his head. Then he replied, his voice full of mockery. "It's sad, isn't it? Horrendous. Beggars belief. Horrific. For anyone to go down there and do a thing like that." It boggles the mind that Bryant thought that these repeated denials were even worth the energy, along with statements of shock that were absolutely brimming with sarcasm. Perhaps Bryant was just acting petulantly after being backed into a corner. But there are indications that Bryant was working some sort of half-cocked strategy to get a lighter sentence for his crimes. When asked what should happen to him, Bryant replied, "I should get out. Of course I should get out. I should get out on bail tomorrow. I pay the money, the money." He flicked his hands like he was tossing dollar bills. No doubt he was thinking of his large fortune. A detective asked, "Why do you reckon you should be out then?" At this point, Bryant outright whined, "Because it's not fair on me, is it? I mean, I know I've done a wrong thing, but surely they can claim a few months, a year, for what I've done. We can work things out." At one point during the interrogation, detectives were quietly making notes, and Bryant mistakenly believed that the police had stopped the video camera from recording. He said to one of the detectives, "I'm sure you'll find the person that caused all this." Then Bryant whispered conspiratorially, pointing to himself, and said, "Me." He grinned like a Cheshire cat. The detective replied, "I don't find that a very funny statement at all, mate, to be honest." Bryant laughed and said, "You should have put that on recording." The detective replied, "Oh, it's still recording at this present stage. So that is on recording." Bryant's smile fell from his face. prison, and a Pepsi. Martin Bryant was arraigned in the Supreme Court of Tasmania, facing 72 charges. These included 35 counts of first-degree murder, 20 counts of attempted murder, 8 counts of wounding, 4 counts of aggravated assault, 3 counts of grievous bodily harm, and 2 counts of arson. The prosecution did not bother with kidnapping or firearms charges. Despite all the evidence, Bryant pleaded not guilty. The case would go to trial. As such, Bryant was assigned a defense lawyer, John Avery, a Supreme Court barrister with 24 years' experience. Avery's first meeting with Bryant was peculiar. Bryant was brought into the room in a wheelchair, with his legs manacled and wrists cuffed to the handles, as if he was some sort of low-rent Antipodean Hannibal Lecter. Combined with the initial media coverage of the massacre, which depicted Bryant as a demonic figure, Avery was full of apprehension. But within a few seconds of Bryant grinning like an idiot and giggling like a schoolgirl, Avery's fears rapidly melted away. Bryant started out by telling Avery that he hadn't even gone to Port Arthur that day. He'd simply rocked up to a nearby service station and kidnapped a man for no reason. Then he had a standoff with police at Seascape, which accidentally caught fire, and 3 corpses just appeared there for some reason. John Avery said, "Look, Martin, that's just bullshit. That doesn't sit with anything we know." According to Avery, Bryant threw back his head and laughed, and then proceeded to give his defense lawyer a full confession that was consistent with the evidence. In addition to the story, Bryant drew diagrams of the cafe, parking lot, service station, and Seascape, revealing his movements and how the various murders unfolded. Avery says that while Bryant made his confession, the killer seemed thrilled. Bryant compared the massacre to driving a fast car or speedboat. After extracting this confession in private, it became John Avery's goal to convince Bryant to plead guilty in court. Quote, "It seemed to me from day one that the evidence against him was so overwhelming and the outcome of the trial so obvious that I was trying to avoid a show trial, a circus, a pantomime, call it what you like, because that would have been absolute stupidity. But it also involved having these witnesses, damaged people, come to court and have to give evidence where the outcome was always inevitable." Despite the twisted nature of the massacre and Bryant's sickening behavior, there was no question of going for an insanity plea. There was a rather high bar for that. The defendant had to be out of his mind during the commission of the crimes, not aware of what he was doing. And it was clear that Bryant knew exactly what he was doing. He may have been low IQ, he may have been a psychopath, but he was in control of his own actions. Since his arrest, he'd been assessed by a psychologist. Despite speculation from his childhood, Bryant did not have schizophrenia. The only other condition he was later diagnosed with was Asperger's syndrome, but that doesn't create diminished capacity, and the overwhelming majority of people on the spectrum are highly moral, law-abiding people, even more so than the general population. The best argument one could make is that Bryant's intellectual disability constituted diminished capacity in and of itself. But psychologists deemed Bryant fit to stand trial, and that argument was never even attempted. In a bid to get Bryant to plead guilty to murder and attempted murder, Avery played on his insecurities, telling him that if he pleaded not guilty and it went to trial, he'd be made to look a fool. The prosecution would tear him to pieces. Quote, "They're going to make you look stupid. They'll say, 'Simple Martin, simple fellow.'" Looking stupid was the exact opposite impression Bryant wanted to achieve. He wanted to be seen as powerful, an arch criminal, not an idiot. And so, Bryant told Avery that he'd plead guilty to the 35 murders, but he intended to plead not guilty to the 20 attempted murders and various assaults. It was characteristically nonsensical, but that way, there would still be a trial. Bryant would still get press attention, and he'd force 23 people he'd maimed to come to court to give testimony, to point him out to the jury, to claim he was this big, bad, evil man. Bryant did not give two shits in a sock how traumatizing that might be for them. Again, Avery stressed that the prosecution would make Bryant look like a fool. They go over his life history, his failures at school, his failed relationships, his tendency to alienate people, his lonely, pathetic existence. Eventually, after several months of persuasion, Bryant finally relented. He requested a blank A4 piece of paper. Avery fetched one for him. Then Bryant wrote 3 lines in huge block letters that took up the entire page, as if it were written by an 8-year-old. To John Avery, I, Martin Bryant, wish to plead guilty to all charges, 72. I wish my lawyer to tell the court that I want to change my plea from not guilty to guilty. Date 24 October 1996. Martin Bryant. To those listening, the note was riddled with typos. On November 7th, 1996, Martin Bryant pled guilty to all 72 charges. On November 22nd, the judge sentenced Bryant to 35 life sentences, 1 for each murder, to be served concurrently, without the possibility of parole, plus 25 years for the charges of attempted murder, assault, grievous bodily harm, wounding, and arson. He would die in prison. Bryant's reaction upon the sentencing was to ask his lawyer, John Avery, for a Pepsi. Bryant's case was notorious, potentially making him a target by other prison inmates. Until July 1997, he was kept in solitary confinement in a purpose-built cell that had 24-hour observation. Bryant instructed Avery to insist that he be put in with Gen Pop. Avery later said, I think he thought he'd be lauded by them. That was the exact opposite of what would have happened, in my view. But he continued to protest. No, they'll like me. They'll get on with me. Nevertheless, Bryant was kept in protective custody for years. The not unreasonable fear was that another lifer, who didn't mind a couple extra years chalked on his sentence, might try to take a pop at him simply as a trophy killing. As it was, a brief encounter with an inmate in July 2003 saw Bryant briefly hospitalized. The inmate had seized his chance and sprayed toilet disinfectant in Bryant's eyes. 10 years into his sentence, in November 2006, Bryant was transferred to a secure mental health unit, the Wilfred Lopez Center near Risdon Prison, outside Hobart, where he received counseling, medication, and was allowed to interact with 35 other inmates. There were no incidents of violence, except those Bryant inflicted on himself. In March 2007, Bryant got a hold of a razor blade and attempted to slit his wrists. The wounds were superficial. 2 days later, Bryant got a hold of another razor blade and cut his own throat, leading to his hospitalization. He is reportedly a pariah among the prisoners and has not made any friends. Due to poor diet and lack of exercise, Bryant has gained a tremendous amount of weight. His only visitor is his mother, Carleen Bryant. In 2011, she released a book giving an account of her son's life and her reaction to the massacre. She also gave an interview to 60 Minutes Australia in connection with the book. Carleen expressed disbelief that Martin Bryant actually committed the Port Arthur massacre, stressing that the evidence was never tested at trial. This is widely recognized as a mother's way of coping with having a child who has committed horrendous crimes. Her position was fueled by conspiracy theories that Port Arthur was a government psyop conducted to bring strict gun control to Australia. More on that later. Given the evidence against Bryant, this is doubtful. In the years since 2011, there have been mixed reports that Carleen has either accepted or continues to deny her son's guilt. Meanwhile, Martin Bryant himself continues to deny responsibility for the massacre. As a side note, his defense lawyer, John Avery, was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months in prison in September 2008 for fraud, theft, and the misappropriation of $512,000 from his law firm. Avery used much of this money to purchase a substantial collection of art. Gun control in light and shade. In the aftermath of all that senseless slaughter, the Australian government scrambled to bring in stricter gun control, a process which is often held up as a success story by gun control advocates in other countries, particularly the United States. The popular conception seems to be, after Port Arthur, gun control was brought in, there were no more mass shootings, and everyone lived happily ever after. The picture is a little more complicated than that. So we'll dive in. You're all grown adults watching this. You've probably already made up your mind. Changing it or confirming your opinion is not my job. This is a true crime video, not an episode of Schoolhouse Rock. So what I'm going to do is present you with an array of facts and information which can be interpreted in either direction, and you can draw your own conclusions. But a more intriguing question from the perspective of a true crime buff is whether the measures brought in after Port Arthur could have prevented Martin Bryant from doing what he did if they had been installed earlier. Back on May 2nd, 1996, 4 days after the Port Arthur massacre, Prime Minister John Howard delivered a speech in Parliament calling for a ban on the possession, sale, and importation of all automatic and semi-automatic weapons in Australia. This is considered notable by foreign observers because John Howard was, at least on paper, a right-wing politician, whom one might assume would be pro-gun, or at least have a wishy-washy stance on the issue. In reality, the federal government, regardless of political affiliation, had been pushing for stricter gun control for several years. First, there were two left-wing governments, but the right-wing opposition supported it, and after John Howard's election in March 1996, just a month prior to the massacre, there had been no change of policy. The federal government, regardless of where they fell on the political spectrum, wanted strict gun control. However, their attempts had not been entirely successful. While the Australian Constitution has no equivalent of the American Second Amendment, the problem for the federal government was the Constitution also does not give them any power to legislate on firearms. That power resides with the Australian states. In 1996, some states were in favor of strict gun control. Others resisted. Not that the resisting states were the equivalent of the Wild West. This may sound strange to American listeners, but even prior to 1996, nowhere in Australia could the average person legally own a gun simply for reasons of self-defense. You needed to supply a different reason. Maybe you did target shooting. Maybe you hunted. Maybe you were a farmer who used a gun to clear out pests. In some states, you needed to regularly prove that these reasons remained true. But self-defense, in and of itself, was not enough. So, even prior to 1996, you could forget about open carry or concealed carry in public, and you could very well be prosecuted if you shot someone who was assaulting, raping, or robbing you. And if you wanted to own a handgun, the type of firearm most often used in defensive situations, you needed to be either licensed security, a gun collector, or a recreational pistol target shooter with a valid club membership. And that's all the handguns could be used for. It's why, in 1996, handguns made up just 5% of the civilian arsenal in Australia, compared to about 1/3 of the guns in the United States at the time. It's also illegal for most Australians to carry a taser, or even so much as a can of pepper spray. And it's why, when Martin Bryant opened fire in Port Arthur on April 28, 1996, even in the pro-gun state of Tasmania, nobody else who was there that day was armed. Bryant knew he could go to Port Arthur with his big bag of guns and target 600 people, and he would be unlikely to get shot at until the police arrived. As it was, it took the first two patrolmen 30 minutes, and reinforcements and special ops took additional hours. Bryant had a free hand at Port Arthur and made it all the way back to Seascape Guest House with a hostage. At the time of the Port Arthur massacre, semi-automatic weapons, the kind that Martin Bryant used that day, were effectively banned from private ownership by the average person in 6 of the 8 Australian states and territories. The only states that permitted the average civilian to own a semi-automatic weapon without a special permit, and with the same ease as owning a bolt-action hunting rifle, were Queensland and Tasmania. Much of the federal government's efforts after Port Arthur targeted those states specifically. On May 10th, 1996, 12 days after the massacre, the Prime Minister convened a meeting of gun regulators from all the states and territories, known as the Australasian Police Ministers' Council, and they agreed to a sweeping set of gun control measures. The resulting National Firearms Agreement banned semi-automatic weapons from ownership, sale, or manufacture across Australia. All legal firearms henceforth had to be registered with the government. It reiterated the existing laws that self-defense was not an excuse for getting a gun. It brought in strict storage requirements, which were subject to home spot checks by police. Restrictions were also placed on the ammo capacity and caliber of rifles, shotguns, and handguns. Anything exceeding those criteria became illegal. And state governments could now seize and confiscate firearms for a plethora of reasons, from getting a criminal conviction, to failing to notify the government of a change of address, to simply being deemed by local authorities as not being of good character. After the National Firearms Agreement was reached, state governments set a 12-month clock on the now banned weapons, semi-automatic or otherwise, before people would be prosecuted for owning them. The 12 months came with legal amnesty and monetary compensation for those who surrendered their guns. In order to afford the compensation, the government made a one-off jolt increase in people's annual taxes, which raised $500 million, of which $300 million was actually spent on compensating people for turning in their weapons. The rest was funneled into other government departments and programs. In the 12 months following the National Firearms Agreement in May 1996, the government collected 650,000 guns out of an estimated national civilian arsenal of 3.5 million weapons. Footage of gigantic piles of guns were broadcast on the news and transmitted all over the world. Initially, the states of Queensland and Tasmania resisted the measures of the National Firearms Agreement, but Prime Minister John Howard threatened to hold a national referendum to amend the Australian Constitution, giving the federal government sweeping powers to regulate firearms instead of the states. Howard later went on to say, quote, "I hate guns. Ordinary citizens should not have weapons. We do not want the American disease imported into Australia." In the aftermath of Port Arthur, the overwhelming majority of the country was in favor of stricter gun control and would likely vote yes in such a referendum. And so, Queensland and Tasmania signed up to the agreement in order to retain some semblance of control over their own gun policies. The question is, would the laws as they now exist have prevented Martin Bryant from carrying out the Port Arthur massacre? The answer is probably not, but the death toll arguably would have been lower. To some extent, the law did not matter. Bryant did not have a license and bought his weapons under the table. Incidentally, the vendor that Bryant named, Terry Hill, was not prosecuted for the illegal sale because he was given immunity in exchange for providing information against Bryant. Under existing gun laws today, Bryant still could have obtained firearms somewhere without a license if he paid enough money. However, it is unlikely they would have been semi-automatic weapons. The national ban has been fairly effective in keeping them out of the hands of civilians. That's not to say there isn't a black market in Australia. There are an estimated 415,000 unregistered guns circulating around the nation, or 13.4% of all guns in the country. But semi-automatic weapons are a small minority of these firearms, and most of them reside in the hands of high-level organized crime, namely bikers and mafia. Someone like Bryant would not have made the hardcore criminal contacts necessary to lay his hands on semi-automatics. More likely, he would have obtained unregistered hunting rifles and shotguns from petty criminals on the black market, guns which require manual loading and have limited ammo capacities. At a stretch, he could have acquired a handgun or two. Without semi-automatic rifles, Bryant could not have killed 20 people and wounded 12 in 90 seconds at the cafe. A rifle that required Bryant to clear the cartridge and load another bullet by hand would have significantly reduced the death toll as people made their escape. And a shotgun he could have realistically obtained on the black market would have a limited number of shells, no more than 5, perhaps as few as 2, before needing to be reloaded. At close quarters in the cafe, Bryant could have used handguns, which are semi-automatic, to shoot faster, but it still seems unlikely he could have hit 32 people in 90 seconds, since civilian-owned handguns in Australia typically must contain no more than 10 rounds. He would have needed to barricade the exit before he started shooting, or else most of the 60 occupants of the cafe would have fled. The death toll in the cafe still could have been considerable, perhaps 5, 10, even 15 people, depending on how things unfolded, and even one casualty is too many. But once Bryant moved out into the parking lot, casualties would have declined significantly without a semi-automatic rifle. Handguns would have had poorer range and accuracy. A hunting rifle would be more effective, but at a much reduced rate of fire. It seems less likely that Bryant could have killed an additional 4 people and wounded 4 as he took pot shots at the fleeing crowds from a distance in the parking lot. However, the 7 people, including 2 children, that Bryant murdered at the entrance to the historic site were all executed at close range. Those murders could have been committed with a rifle, shotgun, handgun, or a mixture of all the above. Including the 2 Seascape murders, the service station murder, and the murder of his hostage, Martin Bryant conceivably still could have killed between 16 and 26 people during the Port Arthur Massacre, instead of 35. Bottom line, the strictures of the National Firearms Agreement do not prevent a nutcase with money to burn from illegally acquiring weapons and opening fire on an unsuspecting public. That goes double for a licensed individual who acquires his weapons legally and decides to go on a shooting spree. And indeed, contrary to numerous reports by foreign sources, which claim there have been 0 gun rampages in Australia since 1996, there have actually been many such incidents in the years following Port Arthur. A total of 22 such shootings have occurred in the 29 years between Port Arthur and 2025, which, put together, have produced a total of 58 dead and 62 wounded. For comparison, in the equivalent 29 years prior to the Port Arthur Massacre, there were 30 shootings, with casualties adding up to 133 dead and 68 wounded. So, the number of mass shootings seems relatively the same. However, there has been a 50% reduction in the total number of fatalities, likely because of restrictions on semi-automatics. You also have to consider population growth. From 1967 to 1996, Australia's population grew from 11 to 18 million. From 96 to 2025, from 18 to 26 million. In that sense, strict gun laws have made a moderate difference in the number of shootings and the number of people killed in such events. When it comes to gun rampages in Australia in general, the average number of people killed is between 3 and 5 on either side of Port Arthur. In that sense, Martin Bryant's rampage, with 35 dead and 23 wounded, is very much an anomaly in Australian history, and hopefully always will be. No other shooting in modern Australian history comes close, with the runner-ups having death tolls of 7 to 10 people killed, and those incidents falling on either side of 1996. There has also been a shift to knives as the Australian murder weapon of choice, as we have seen in most countries that adopt strict gun control. Less well documented in Australia are the modern mass stabbings that occur, such as the Bondi Junction stabbings in 2024 that killed 6 and injured 12. Despite wielding an inferior non-projectile weapon, the perpetrator killed and injured as many people as an above-average Australian gun rampage. A major factor in the extent of the death toll, beyond the weapon of choice, appears to be police response time to defend an unarmed public from a madman. More broadly, with the introduction of stricter gun control, the share of total homicides by knives and blunt force objects has largely filled the gap left by guns. There has also been an uptick on people secretly and illegally carrying knives in public, either with criminal intent or for supposed self-defense. Meanwhile, the National Firearms Agreement has not played a significant role in the reduction of the overall homicide rate in Australia, which was shrinking prior to 1996, mirroring trends in other Western countries, regardless of their gun laws. Increased video surveillance and advancing forensic technology seem to be more powerful factors in that reduction. But it is undeniable that the NFA has helped reduce gun murders in Australia, specifically, and gun suicides since 1996. Knives have taken up the slack with the murders, and hanging has become the leading method of suicide. And this is a direct result of making it more difficult for firearms to proliferate amongst the general public and to shrewdly keep tabs on those guns that do, confiscating them when deemed necessary. Nearly 30 years on from the Port Arthur Massacre, Australia today has attained the same amount of guns in circulation as it did in 1996, approximately 3.5 million. But those guns are now clustered in the hands of very few people: enthusiasts, collectors, target shooters, hunters, and farmers, with a 75% reduction in the number of individual households that own a gun. And the majority of those guns are bolt-action rifles and double-barrel shotguns, with very few people possessing handguns and almost nobody having a semi-automatic weapon. So, as mentioned, I leave it up to the audience to debate whether gun control in Australia has been a success, and to what extent, and whether or not it should be emulated or avoided in your own country. But one thing is clear. In the aftermath of the Port Arthur Massacre, the majority of the Australian public felt that some sort of action needed to be taken to prevent a madman from racking up such a harrowing death toll in the future. So they grasped about for a solution, any solution that was offered to them at the time. They couldn't wait on human nature changing or improving itself, because humanity will continue to produce Martin Bryants and many other species of monster for as long as there are people to draw breath. The fight between light and dark, between good and evil, is very real, very human, and eternal. For the sake of those who died, the Broken Arrow Cafe at the Port Arthur Historic Site is today an empty shell. It has no roof, no doors, no tables, no gift shop. Only the stone walls remain. The public is free to wander its barren structure, to contemplate the horrors that took place there. Beyond the cafe is a quiet memorial garden and a tranquil remembrance pool with 35 stone leaves on a small plinth representing each of the people killed. In the garden there's a small inscription that reads, "May we who come to this garden cherish life for the sake of those who died. Cherish compassion for the sake of those who gave aid. Cherish peace for the sake of those in pain." Thank you for watching.